We welcome you again to our preaching services for the Newport Church of Christ. We are studying in the book of Psalms. I've entitled this series Preaching Through the Psalms, or Studies in the Psalms. And we're going to be looking today at Psalms chapter 17. We pray that you will take your own Bible and study along with us. Psalm 17 contains some 15 verses. I've entitled this particular chapter, The Prayer of a Suffering Servant, or the Prayer of a Suffering Saint. As we live in this world, we know as Christians we are not exempt to problems and persecutions, to heartache and hardships like so many of people of the world seem to be exempted. The theme of Psalms chapter 17 is that of prayer. What do we do when we are faced with hardship and heartache in this life? Now, last time we studied together, we looked at Psalm chapter 16, and Psalm 16 was entitled The Promise of Preservation for the Persecuted. We noted the practice of a godly man, the portion of a godly man, and the prospects of a godly man. A righteous or godly man's faith, his fortune, and his future. As we look to Psalm 17 here today, we understand this psalm was written by David. He was later to become the king of Israel, one of the greatest kings Israel ever had. David was referenced in Acts 13:22 as a man after God's own heart, yet David was a man, and he certainly was not a perfect man, as was the Son of God, Jesus Christ. He made his share of mistakes, just as you and I do today. The occasion of Psalms chapter 17 is really not known with certainty. Many scholars suggest that it was written at a time when David was being persecuted by King Saul. And one of those instances is found in 1 Samuel 26, verses 19 and following. The inscription of Psalm 17, if you'll look in your Bible, it is said to be a prayer of David. Thus the theme is that of prayer. I saw a marquee on a church sign just a few days ago, and it said in reference to prayer, we should pray harder when it is harder to pray. So many times we are faced with difficulty and uncertainty in life, and it's hard to pray, and yet we should pray harder in those difficult times, should we not? One scholar has said of Psalm 17, instead of asking who penned this particular chapter, we should be asking who prayed this particular chapter. And I really like that. When I look at David, we understand he was a man of God, but he was also a man of prayer. Now, inspiration, when we look at Scripture, we understand inspiration is God revealing the very words. David was inspired to pen these words, and yet there is a lot of personal experience from the life of David as we look at Psalm chapter 17. We see God, the author, using David as the penman, showing his anguish when he saw the righteous suffering. Now, some commentators suggest Psalm 17 is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26. Now, I want to be careful to point out this is not a direct prophecy of Christ's suffering here in Psalm 17, but it is reminiscent of the prayer that Christ prayed. Matthew 26 in verse 38 and following, you might recall he prayed 3 times to the Father in anguish, in agony, as he prayed that the cup of suffering, pain, and problems that he was facing would be removed. Yet his mindset was not as my will is, but rather as the will of the Father is and should be. Now, with that in mind, the prayer of a suffering servant, Psalm chapter 17, first the psalmist prays, and here's your outline, verses 1 to 6, Lord, hear me. Then in Psalm 17, verses 7 through 9, the psalmist prays, Lord, hide me. And then in Psalm 17, verses 10 through 15, the psalmist prays, Lord, help me. All those beginning with the letter H. Hear, hide, and help. Psalm chapter 17 and verse 1, the prayer of a suffering servant. The psalmist prays in verses 1 to 6, Lord, hear me. Look at the supplication here. Verse 1 and into verse 2, Lord, I want you to examine me. Verses 3 and 4, Lord, I want you to exonerate me. And then verses 5 and 6, Lord, I want you to exercise me. Verses 1 and 2, David the psalmist is pleading for the Lord to examine. He says, hear the right or the righteous, O Lord, attend unto my cry, give ear unto my prayer, that goeth not out of feigned lips. You see, David was very genuine, very sincere in this prayer. Look at verse 2. Let my sentence come forth from thy presence. Let thine eyes behold the things that are equal. David was wanting justice. And he implies here a petition for the justice of a righteous God. Lord, examine me, verses 1 and 2. But then verses 3 and 4, Lord, exonerate me. We see a purpose to restrain here in verse 3 and then to verse 4. The first part of verse 3, thou hast proved mine heart. Thou hast visited me in the night. Thou hast tried me and shalt find nothing. Here in the first part of verse 3, Lord, you know my wishes. You know, the heart of man has secrets that may not always be revealed outwardly. But in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 14, Solomon speaks of how God knows even the secret things of man. And those things in the mind of man are going to be brought forth to the judgment. My wishes, my heart's secrets, God knows. Understand that. But then the latter part of verse 3, David says, I am purposed that my mouth shall not transgress. Lord, you know not only my wishes, the first part of verse 3, Lord, you know also my words, the latter part of verse 3. You see, the heart may have secrets, and those secrets generally are spoken sooner or later. Matthew 12:34 and following. Christ tells us, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. So my wishes, my words, verse 3, lead to my works. Look at verse 4. David says, concerning the works of men, by the word of thy lips, I have kept me from the paths of the destroyer. You see, the heart may have secrets, and the heart generally speaks those secrets, but the heart selects the works that we do. I'm reminded of the 7 churches of Revelation, chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book of Revelation. And in each of those 7 churches, as they are addressed, God said this phrase, I know thy works. And God knows our works today. Lord, I want you to examine me. Psalm 17, verses 1 and 2. Lord, I want you to exonerate me. Psalm 17, verses 3 and 4. But then in verse 5 and into verse 6, Lord, I want you to exercise me. We see a petition for justice, verses 1 and 2, a purpose for restraint, verses 3 and 4, and a prayer for guidance, verses 5 and 6. In verse 5, Lord, I need security. David says, hold up my goings in thy paths. that my footsteps slip not. Here David is pleading with God in this prayer. Hold me, Lord, and harbor me. Psalm 46 and verse 1, we often reflect of how the Lord is our strength. He is our refuge in time of trouble, and rightfully so. But then I need security, verse 5, but I also need supplication, verse 6. I have called upon thee. Now here David the psalmist in a prayer, he's calling upon God, for thou wilt hear me. He's calling with confidence, knowing and understanding that God will acknowledge his prayer, that thou wilt hear me, O God, incline thine ear unto me, and hear my speech. In verse 5, security. David pleads with the Lord to hold and harbor him. In verse 6, supplication, as David pleads with God to hear him and to honor him. You know, prayer is a great blessing, a communication link for the righteous with Jehovah God. I'm reminded of James 5 and verse 16, where James says that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. The psalmist prays in Psalm 17, verses 1 to 6, Lord, hear me. Hear my supplication. And guess what? The Lord will hear the supplication, the prayer of the righteous man. But then look at verses 7 through 9. The psalmist prays, not only Lord, hear me, but Lord, hide me. First we see the supplication beginning in verses 1 to 6. Now we see the safety that he is desiring because of the heartache and the hardship that he is facing in his life. The first part of verse 7, we see mercy. The latter part of verse 7, we see God in his mightiness. And then verse 8 and into verse 9, we see how God is moved when he sees what we face, the hardships of life. First in verse 7, the first part of the verse, Lord, you know how to be merciful. Show thy marvelous loving kindness, David says here. Show me, God has a concern for me. He has a concern for you. Psalm 136 and verse 1. The latter part of each of those verses of Psalm 136 tells us that the mercy of the Lord endureth forever. We serve a merciful God. God knows how to be merciful to those who are suffering. But then the latter part of verse 7, Lord, you know how to be mighty. We serve a mighty God. O thou that savest by thy right hand, them which put their trust in thee, from those that rise up against them. Here David understands that God needs to be speaking to him. He needs to be counseling him, helping him to understand the events of the past as he looks forward to the future. Psalm 18 and verse 2, understand the Lord is my rock. He is my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust. If we truly trust in our God, we understand his mighty works through his counsel or through his word. He speaks to us. He shows us. But then verse 8 into verse 9, Lord, you know how to be moved. David says, keep me as the apple of the eye. Hide me under the shadow of thy wings. From the wicked that oppress me, from the deadly enemies who compass me about. David wants the Lord to show him, to speak to him, but now he wants the Lord to shield him. We serve a God of compassion, do we not? The record speaks in Matthew 15:32, when Christ saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion. He was deeply concerned with them as he's deeply concerned with man even today. The psalmist prays, Lord, hear me, in supplication. He prays, Lord, hide me in safety. But then look, if you will, verses 10 through 15. The psalmist prays, Lord, help me. He wants the support that God, he understands, can provide. In verses 10 through 12, Lord, I'm going to tell you about my problems and circumstances. And then in Psalm chapter 17, verses 13 through 15, Lord, I'm going to trust you with my problems and circumstances. Look at verses 10 through 12. First, Lord, I'm going to tell you. The psalmist has a passion for the protection of God. When he reflects back to the wicked, look at verse 10. He says, they are enclosed in their own fat. With their mouth they speak proudly. The wicked speak with a proud tongue. In their pride or arrogance, verse 10. In their prowling or aggressiveness, verse 11. In their plotting or assertiveness, verse 12. They're proud, they're self-sufficient, enclosed in their own fatness. Their mouth in arrogance boast of their self-sufficiency and their superiority, at least in their minds, the wicked man that is. But remember what Solomon said in Proverbs 16 and verse 18. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. The wicked are proud, verse 10, but then the wicked are prowling. Look at verse 11. They have now compassed us in their steps. They have set their eyes bowing down to the earth. They are proud, their arrogance, verse 10. They are prowling, their aggressiveness, verse 11. Remember, Peter in 1 Peter 5:8 tells us that we're to be sober, to be vigilant, because our adversary, as a roaring lion, he walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Satan and his adversaries, they are arrogant, they are aggressive. But then look at verse 12. The wicked are plotting. They're very assertive in what they do. Like as a lion that is greedy of his prey, and as it were a young lion lurking in secret places. We have a picture here of the wicked man. He is plotting against the righteous man. He is asserting his strength, his military might, if you will, being very aggressive, very arrogant toward the righteous man. You remember what Christ said of the false prophets in Matthew 7 and verse 15? To beware, because they come in sheep's clothing. We need to beware as the wicked plot and prowl in their pride against the righteous. Lord, I'm going to tell you about my problems, my circumstances. Nothing wrong with speaking to God, trying to get ourselves in the mindset, understanding that he will listen, that he will hear, that he will help. But then, Lord, I'm going to trust you with my problems and my circumstances. Look at verses 13 through 15. Verse 13 and 14, Lord, save me. And then verse 15, Lord, satisfy me. Look carefully, verses 13 and 14. Lord, save me. He says, arise, O Lord, disappoint him, that is the wicked, cast him down, deliver my soul from the wicked, which is thy sword. From men which are thy hand, O Lord, from men of the world, which have their portion in this life. You know, the wicked people, they may have a temporary reward or a temporary blessing, so they think in this life, whose belly thou fillest with thy hid treasure. They are full of children and leave the rest of their substance to their babes. The psalmist here, David, speaks of the apparent prosperity, but keep in mind it's only from a worldly standpoint. The apparent prosperity that the wicked seem to have. Lord, save me. A plea for deliverance, a plea for salvation. You know, we can have salvation today as we live in the midst of a wicked and sinful people of the world, if we're willing to submit to God through Jesus Christ. Jesus became the author of eternal salvation, Hebrews 5, verses 8 and 9, unto all them that obey him. Lord, save me, verse 13 and 14, but now, Lord, satisfy me. Look at verse 15 as David concludes. He says, as for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. David steps back and takes a second look at his circumstances, at his situation, and he realizes what we need to be realizing today, that God is still in control of all things, and God will ultimately have the last say. As for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I await with thy likeness. A plea for deliverance or salvation, but then a praise for that deliverance, for that satisfaction that God has given to us even today. I'm reminded of Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 14, when he says, my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord. The Lord is good to his people now, and he will be good to his people in eternity. David pictures himself as waking up and seeing things clearly now with the likeness of God, having satisfaction. A prayer of a suffering servant is seen in Psalm chapter 17. We noted time and time again throughout our studies, prayer is our communication link with God. It's how we communicate to God, and he communicates to us through his word. Prayer expresses our heart's desire to God, our petitions, our supplications. John records the words of Jesus in John 9:31, and he says, for we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him God heareth. Peter declared, 1 Peter 3 and verse 12, when he speaks of the righteous and the wicked, we know that God, his face is against the wicked, but his ear, his eye, his ear, his face is open unto them that are righteous. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. Paul in the Philippian epistle speaks of how when we face problems and persecution, heartache and problems in this life, he says we're to be anxious or careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And if you're doing that, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ. That's really the way David ended here when he speaks of the satisfaction of Psalm 17 and verse 15. The prayer of a suffering servant, the psalmist prays, Lord, hear me in supplication. He prays, Lord, hide me in safety. And he prays, Lord, help me in support. We thank you for being with us today and pray that you'll tune in again next week. If we can be of assistance to you in any way, we ask that you please contact us. Until next time, you have a good day.